There is a voice that has followed you for as long as you can remember. It comments on your decisions before you make them. It criticizes your mistakes long after everyone else has forgotten them. It rehearses conversations that never happen, invents arguments that never existed, and whispers warnings about futures that may never arrive. Most people believe this voice is the essence of who they are. They call it the self. They call it consciousness. They call it me. But what if that assumption is the greatest misunderstanding in human history? Imagine waking tomorrow to discover that the narrator inside your mind is not your own. Not because someone is controlling you, not because of science fiction or supernatural possession, but because the mechanism producing that voice was never designed to express your deepest identity. Instead, it evolved to solve problems, predict danger, imitate the people around you, and preserve a biological organism long enough to survive another day. If that were true, then every moment of self-doubt would sound different. Every regret would carry a different meaning. Every fear would suddenly have an identifiable source. The possibility is unsettling because it attacks something we rarely question. We question governments. We question history. We question the media. Yet almost nobody questions the one narrator that speaks inside their head from the moment they wake until the moment they fall asleep. The strange part is that many of history's greatest thinkers did. Thousands of years before neuroscience mapped the human brain, Buddhist monks described an endless stream of mental chatter that creates suffering by convincing us it is identical to our true nature. Ancient Hindu philosophy distinguished between the observing awareness and the restless mind. Stoic philosophers warned that our impressions arrive before our judgment, and wisdom begins when we learn to separate the two. Mystics across cultures spoke of an inner witness that remains untouched while thoughts rise and disappear like clouds across the sky. Centuries later, psychology would begin describing remarkably similar phenomena using different language. Then neuroscience entered the conversation. Instead of asking what consciousness feels like, scientists asked a different question. Which networks in the brain become active when people are doing absolutely nothing? The answer was unexpected. When volunteers lay quietly inside brain scanners with no task to perform, one network consistently became more active rather than less. It was as though the brain immediately filled silence with internal narration. Researchers eventually named this collection of regions the default mode network. Rather than resting, the brain began constructing stories about the past, the future, relationships, identity, status, success, failure, and imagined conversations. The mind did not become empty. It became louder. This discovery changed the scientific understanding of mental life. The brain appears to spend enormous amounts of energy generating simulations, rather than simply experiencing reality as it unfolds. That internal narrator is constantly predicting, constantly comparing, constantly editing, constantly rewriting the meaning of everything that happens. Yet none of this proves the voice is you. In fact, it raises an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps what you call your identity is only the brain's best ongoing prediction about who must exist to explain the current moment. Consider how easily the voice changes depending on circumstance. When you are alone, it speaks one way. When you stand before a crowd, it speaks another. After criticism, it becomes harsher. After praise, it becomes more confident. When exhausted, it predicts failure. When hopeful, it predicts opportunity. The narrator is astonishingly flexible. It borrows accents, phrases, beliefs, and emotional tones from parents, teachers, friends, cultures, books, films, religions, and strangers encountered decades earlier. Listen carefully during moments of anxiety. How many of your thoughts sound exactly like someone who once judged you? How many of your fears were originally spoken by another person? How many rules governing your life were accepted before you were old enough to question them? Developmental psychologists have long observed that children construct their internal dialogue by absorbing external voices. Parents teach language, but they also teach invisible habits of interpretation. Encouragement becomes self-confidence. Constant criticism becomes self-criticism. Expectations become identity. Eventually, the external voices disappear, but they leave an echo. The child grows into an adult, convinced those echoes are authentic expressions of the self. Imagine entering a cathedral filled with thousands of whispers from every person you have ever met. Over years, the whispers blend together until they become indistinguishable from your own thinking. You no longer hear individual speakers. You hear only one continuous narrator. Would you still call that voice yours? Or would you recognize it as an archive? Memory itself complicates the mystery. Every time you remember an event, you are not opening a perfect recording stored somewhere inside the brain. Neuroscientists have discovered that memories are reconstructed each time they are recalled. They change subtly with every retrieval. New emotions become attached, details disappear, others emerge, stories become smoother, contradictions vanish. The narrator edits continuously, not because it wants to deceive you, because coherent stories are easier for the brain to manage than fragmented uncertainty. This explains why two siblings raised in the same household often remember entirely different childhoods. Their experiences overlapped. Their narrators did not. Each mind assembled a different autobiography from the same raw material. Your life story may therefore be less like a documentary and more like a film constantly being re-edited while it is still playing. Yet despite all these revisions, something remains strangely constant. There is always an awareness that notices the narration itself. You can observe your own thoughts. You can notice anxiety before reacting to it. You can hear the inner critic speaking. You can even disagree with it. This creates one of the deepest puzzles in consciousness. If you can observe the voice, who exactly is doing the observing? The question appears simple. Its consequences are enormous, because the observer cannot be identical to the object being observed. If you watch clouds crossing the sky, you are not the clouds. If you hear music, you are not the music. If you notice thoughts appearing and disappearing, then perhaps you are not the thoughts either. Across cultures and centuries, This realization repeatedly emerges as the beginning of profound transformation. Not because the voice disappears, it rarely does, but because its authority begins to weaken. Imagine spending your entire life believing every actor on a theater stage represents objective reality. Then one evening, the lights briefly illuminate the audience instead. For the first time, you realize you have been watching a performance. Nothing on stage has changed, only your relationship to it. And once that shift occurs, an unsettling possibility begins to unfold. If the voice inside your head was assembled over a lifetime from borrowed language, inherited fears, remembered pain, biological prediction, and endless narrative reconstruction, then somewhere beneath that voice, or perhaps beyond it, something else has been listening all along, and finding that silent listener may change everything you believe about who has been living your life. That silent listener is difficult to describe because it never announces itself. It does not argue. It does not interrupt. It does not demand attention. In fact, the moment you try to grasp it as an object, it seems to disappear behind another thought. The mind immediately begins narrating the experience. This must be it. I'm finally understanding. No, I've lost it. Once again, the familiar voice steps forward, eager to explain reality, before reality has a chance to speak for itself. This habit is so automatic that most of us never notice it. We do not simply experience the world. We experience our explanation of the world. Imagine walking through a forest at sunrise. Before your eyes fully absorb the shifting light between the trees, the narrator has already labeled everything. Oak, pine, birdsong, beautiful morning, good weather, nice place for a walk. Language is astonishingly useful, but every label is also a filter. The moment something receives a name, the brain often stops examining it as if it were truly new. Familiarity becomes a shortcut. Instead of seeing what is actually present, we see what memory predicts should be there. This predictive ability is one of evolution's greatest achievements. Without it, survival would be impossible. Your ancestors did not have time to analyze every rustle in the grass. Assuming danger before certainty often meant the difference between life and death. Natural selection favored nervous systems capable of making rapid predictions from incomplete information. Modern neuroscience increasingly supports this view. Many researchers now describe perception itself as a process of controlled prediction. Rather than passively receiving reality, the brain continuously generates expectations about what should happen next, then compares those expectations with incoming sensory information. Reality, in other words, is never experienced in its raw form. It is interpreted, corrected, updated, predicted again. The voice inside your head serves as the narrator of those predictions. It constructs meaning from fragments. It transforms uncertainty into stories. Most of the time, this system works remarkably well. But sometimes prediction becomes prison. Think about how quickly the narrator reaches conclusions. A stranger fails to smile. They don't like me. A colleague forgets to reply. I've done something wrong. A relationship ends. I'll never find love again. These conclusions arrive with extraordinary confidence, despite having almost no evidence. The narrator prefers certainty over ambiguity because certainty feels safer, even when it is false. Psychologists refer to many of these habits as cognitive biases, systematic shortcuts that help us navigate complexity but often distort reality. Confirmation bias encourages us to notice information supporting our existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. Negativity bias gives greater weight to potential threats than opportunities. The availability heuristic makes recent or emotionally powerful memories seem more common than they actually are. Each bias quietly shapes the narrator's ongoing story. The remarkable part is not that these biases exist. It is that we mistake their output for objective truth. Suppose you wore tinted glasses from birth without ever removing them. Would you realize the world had a color? Or would you assume reality itself possessed that tint? The narrator functions much the same way. It colors every experience while convincing you it is merely reporting facts. History offers countless examples of entire civilizations trapped inside shared narratives. People once believed the sun revolved around the earth because that story matched immediate perception. Many societies accepted rigid social hierarchies because those narratives felt self-evident. Economic systems, political ideologies, religious interpretations, even concepts of success and failure, all are sustained by collective stories repeated until they become invisible. The individual narrator grows inside larger cultural narrators. Every generation inherits explanations before asking questions. The astonishing thing is how effortlessly the mind absorbs them. A child is not born believing that personal worth depends on productivity. A child is not born believing failure defines identity. A child is not born comparing every achievement against strangers. These ideas arrive from outside: family, school, advertising, social media, workplaces. Entire industries now compete for something more valuable than money. They compete for attention. Attention determines which stories become dominant inside the narrator. Every notification interrupts the current narrative and offers another. Every headline competes to define what matters. Every algorithm quietly studies which fears, desires, and identities keep your attention longest. The narrator is no longer shaped only by family and culture. It is increasingly shaped by machines designed to predict human behavior with extraordinary precision. For the first time in history, billions of people carry devices capable of influencing internal dialogue hundreds of times each day. Not through force, through repetition. The brain adapts to whatever it repeatedly encounters. This principle, known as neuroplasticity, allows neurons to strengthen frequently used connections, while weaker pathways gradually fade. Every repeated thought makes future repetitions more likely. The narrator literally trains itself. Anxious thinking strengthens anxious pathways. Hope strengthens hopeful pathways. Self-compassion strengthens emotional resilience. Self-criticism strengthens inner conflict. The voice inside your head is therefore neither fixed nor entirely free. It evolves according to what it repeatedly rehearses. Imagine walking across an untouched field. The first journey leaves only faint traces. Walk the same route every day for years, and eventually a visible path appears. Thoughts behave similarly. Repeated narratives become mental highways. Alternative perspectives become overgrown trails, rarely explored. This explains why changing long-standing beliefs feels surprisingly difficult. The challenge is not merely intellectual. It is biological. The brain has invested enormous energy optimizing familiar pathways. To question them requires uncertainty. Uncertainty demands effort. Effort consumes energy. And the brain is fundamentally an organ evolved to conserve energy whenever possible. So the narrator resists. It insists nothing can change. It predicts failure before experiments begin. It calls old patterns personality. It mistakes familiarity for identity. Yet every so often, life interrupts the script. A near-death experience. The birth of a child. The death of someone deeply loved. A devastating illness. A profound work of art. An overwhelming encounter with nature. A single conversation. Moments like these often produce an astonishing effect. The narrator falls silent, not forever, just long enough for something else to become visible. People frequently struggle to describe such moments. Time seems slower. Colors appear richer. Ordinary objects feel strangely alive. The boundary between observer and world becomes less rigid. Some describe overwhelming peace. Others report awe. Others simply say they felt more real than ever before. Scientists continue debating exactly what happens neurologically during these experiences. Certain brain networks appear to decrease activity, while sensory awareness becomes unusually vivid. Patterns associated with self-referential thinking often weaken, allowing direct perception to dominate over internal commentary. The experience is intensely personal, but remarkably consistent across cultures. The narrator loosens its grip, awareness remains. This distinction has fascinated philosophers for millennia. The French philosopher René Descartes famously concluded, "I think, therefore I am." Yet later, thinkers questioned whether he had reversed the relationship. Perhaps thinking is not proof of existence. Perhaps existence is what makes thinking possible. The awareness that notices thought must already be present before any thought can arise. In that case, the narrator becomes a visitor rather than the owner of consciousness, an instrument rather than the musician, a map rather than the territory. This idea feels abstract until you perform a simple experiment. Right now, without trying to stop your thoughts, simply wait. Observe carefully. You do not choose the next thought before it appears. It arrives unexpectedly. A memory, a worry, a random image, a song lyric, an unfinished task. The narrator claims authorship after the fact. But where did that thought actually come from? What mechanism selected it? Why that one instead of another? No one truly knows. Even neuroscience has yet to explain how subjective conscious experience emerges from physical processes inside the brain. This mystery remains one of science's greatest unanswered questions. The more closely researchers examine consciousness, the stranger it becomes. The voice feels familiar, yet its origins remain elusive. Its authority feels absolute, yet it can be observed. It claims to define who you are, yet it constantly changes, and every contradiction leads toward an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the greatest illusion is not that the voice exists. Perhaps the illusion is believing the voice has ever been the one truly in control. Because if the narrator is only one process unfolding inside a vastly more complex field of awareness, then the question is no longer whether the voice belongs to you. The deeper question is this: who or what has been quietly listening to every word it has ever spoken? If something has been listening all along, then it occupies a peculiar position. It cannot be found in the stream of thoughts because it notices the stream. It cannot be reduced to memory because it witnesses memories appearing and fading. It cannot simply be emotion because emotions change while the capacity to observe them remains. For thousands of years, this realization has stood at the center of humanity's deepest investigations into consciousness. Yet, despite arriving through different cultures, different languages, and different methods, many traditions reached an astonishingly similar conclusion. The voice is not the observer. It is only one of the things being observed. But if that is true, why does the illusion feel so convincing? The answer may lie in one of the brain's most remarkable abilities. It creates continuity from fragments. Your eyes do not perceive the world as one seamless image. Tiny, rapid eye movements constantly shift your focus from one point to another. Between those movements, your brain stitches together countless pieces of information into a stable reality. The same thing happens with identity. Every moment of consciousness is slightly different from the one before it. Your body changes, your emotions fluctuate, memories are rewritten, billions of neurons fire in endlessly changing patterns. Yet somehow, the brain produces the feeling that a single, unchanging I has traveled through every moment since childhood. This continuity feels undeniable, but feeling continuous does not necessarily mean being continuous. Consider a river. Stand beside it for several hours, and it appears to remain the same river. Yet every drop of water is moving. The river has continuity without permanence. The narrator inside your mind functions in much the same way. Its content changes every second. Its stories evolve. Its opinions shift. Its priorities transform. Still, it creates the impression of one uninterrupted self moving through time. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman proposed an illuminating distinction between what he called the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self lives only in the present moment. The remembering self constructs the story. When people describe their lives, they rarely recount every actual experience. Instead, they tell the version assembled afterward by memory. The narrator is less interested in accuracy than coherence. It edits reality into a story that feels meaningful. This explains why brief moments often come to define entire chapters of life. A single embarrassing event can become proof that someone is socially awkward. One failed relationship becomes evidence that love is impossible. A childhood compliment becomes the foundation of lifelong confidence. The narrator selects a handful of scenes and quietly declares, "This is who you are." But identity built from selected memories is not the same as identity itself. Imagine opening a 1,000-page novel and reading only 20 pages, chosen at random. Would you understand the story? Probably not. Yet the narrator frequently constructs an entire identity from a surprisingly small collection of emotionally charged memories. Everything else fades into the background. This process is not malicious. It is efficient. The brain evolved to compress information. Complexity is expensive. Stories save energy. The problem begins when compressed stories harden into unquestioned truths. I've always been this way. I could never change. This is just my personality. Statements like these sound factual. Often they are simply repeated narratives. Modern neuroscience increasingly challenges the idea of a fixed personality. Throughout life, the brain remains capable of reorganizing itself in response to learning, environment, relationships, trauma, and deliberate practice. The architecture changes. Connections strengthen. Others weaken. Entire networks adapt. The narrator, however, often resists acknowledging this flexibility. Why? Because uncertainty threatens prediction. Prediction keeps the organism alive. If identity becomes too fluid, the narrator loses its confidence. It no longer knows what to expect, so it clings to familiar definitions, even painful ones. This helps explain a curious paradox. People often defend beliefs that make them unhappy, not because suffering is desirable, because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty. A painful identity can feel more comfortable than an unknown future. Psychologists call this cognitive consistency. The brain prefers stories that remain internally coherent, even when those stories limit growth. This tendency extends far beyond personal identity. Entire societies rely upon shared narratives that define what success looks like. Earn more, own more, achieve more, become more important. These stories are repeated so frequently that they begin speaking through the narrator itself. Eventually, the voice no longer says, "Society expects this." It says, "I want this." The distinction quietly disappears. This is one reason advertising is so powerful. It rarely sells products alone. It sells identities. Drive this car, wear these clothes, own this technology, become this version of yourself. The narrator eagerly incorporates these suggestions into its ongoing autobiography. Desire begins to sound personal, yet many desires arrive from outside. The philosopher René Girard devoted much of his work to this phenomenon. He argued that humans rarely desire independently. We imitate the desires of others. We want what appears valuable because someone else already values it. According to this view, much of what feels like individual ambition is actually borrowed aspiration. The narrator becomes a mirror reflecting countless external influences. This raises an unsettling possibility. How many of your goals genuinely originated within you? And how many simply became part of the voice because they were repeated often enough? Social media has intensified this process dramatically. For most of human history, individuals compared themselves to a relatively small community. Today, the narrator measures itself against thousands of carefully edited lives every week. Every image becomes another comparison. Every success story becomes another invisible standard. Every carefully curated life becomes another reason to feel incomplete. The narrator thrives on comparison because comparison produces prediction. Prediction produces action. Action once increased survival. But in an environment flooded with artificial social signals, this ancient mechanism begins generating endless dissatisfaction. You achieve one goal. The narrator immediately invents another. You receive recognition. It asks why someone else has more. You solve one problem. It begins rehearsing future problems before they exist. Notice how rarely the narrator allows experience to remain complete. Instead of inhabiting the present, it constantly negotiates with an imagined future. This tendency is so pervasive that many people spend years preparing to live rather than actually living. I'll be happy when I'll finally relax after everything will make sense once. The sentence never ends because the narrator survives by postponing arrival. If it ever declared the journey complete, its predictive machinery would temporarily lose purpose. This observation has led some neuroscientists and philosophers to suggest that the self may be less like a fixed object and more like an ongoing process. Not a noun, a verb, something continuously constructed rather than permanently possessed. Even language may reinforce the illusion. When we say, "I am angry," anger appears to define identity, but the actual experience is temporary. A more accurate description might be, anger is being experienced. Likewise, instead of saying, "I am anxious," one could simply observe, anxiety is present. The difference seems subtle, yet psychologically it is profound. One statement fuses awareness with experience. The other creates space between them. That space may be where freedom begins. Not freedom from thought, not freedom from emotion, but freedom from automatic identification with every mental event. Meditation researchers have observed something remarkable among experienced practitioners. The goal is often misunderstood as eliminating thought. In reality, thoughts continue to arise. The difference lies elsewhere. Practitioners become less entangled with them. The narrator continues speaking, but it gradually loses its unquestioned authority. Thoughts become events rather than commands. Stories become possibilities rather than facts. The voice becomes one instrument in consciousness instead of its unquestioned ruler. This transformation does not require mystical belief. It begins with observation. Notice the next critical thought. Instead of obeying it immediately, simply ask, "Who heard that?" The question is deceptively simple, because the instant you ask it sincerely, the narrator hesitates. For a brief moment, the familiar stream of commentary pauses, not because it has been defeated, but because it has become the object of attention rather than its source. That tiny interruption may last only seconds, yet within it lies one of the oldest discoveries in human history. The observer cannot be reduced to the story it observes. And if that is true, then the voice inside your head has never been the author of your life. It has only been the storyteller. The deeper mystery is still waiting. If the storyteller is not the author, then where does authorship actually begin? If the storyteller is not the author, then perhaps the greatest mystery is not the voice itself. It is the source from which every thought appears. For centuries, people assumed they consciously chose every decision they made. The inner voice seemed to narrate those choices as they unfolded, creating the comforting impression of complete control. It felt obvious. You decide, you act. The narrator explains why. But modern neuroscience began uncovering evidence that challenged this sequence. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted an experiment that would become one of the most debated studies in the science of free will. Volunteers were asked to make a simple movement whenever they wished, while researchers monitored electrical activity in their brains. The results were surprising. A measurable pattern of brain activity, later called the readiness potential, often appeared hundreds of milliseconds before participants reported consciously deciding to move. In other words, the brain appeared to begin preparing an action before conscious awareness claimed ownership of the decision. The implications were immediately controversial. Some interpreted the findings to mean that free will is an illusion. Others argued that consciousness still possesses the ability to approve, delay, or veto an action before it is completed. The debate continues today, yet regardless of where one stands, the experiment exposed something deeply unsettling. The narrator may not be initiating every decision. It may be explaining decisions that have already begun. Think about how often ideas arrive unexpectedly. A melody suddenly appears while driving. The solution to a difficult problem emerges in the shower. A forgotten memory surfaces without invitation. A creative breakthrough arrives after giving up entirely. Artists have described this phenomenon for centuries. Many insist they do not invent their greatest work. They discover it. Scientists tell similar stories. The chemist Auguste Kekulé famously described envisioning the ring structure of benzene during a dream of a serpent biting its own tail. Mathematician Henri Poincaré wrote about solutions arriving during ordinary walks after long periods of unconscious incubation. Writers often speak of characters acting independently, as though the story already existed somewhere beyond deliberate planning. Whether interpreted scientifically or poetically, the pattern remains remarkably consistent. The most valuable insights frequently emerge before the narrator can explain them. This observation aligns with an increasingly accepted view of the brain. Conscious thought represents only a tiny fraction of total mental activity. Beneath awareness, countless processes operate continuously. Your heart regulates itself. Your immune system detects threats. Your visual cortex processes millions of signals. Your memory organizes experiences. Your emotional systems evaluate situations long before conscious reflection begins. Most of what keeps you alive never enters awareness. The narrator arrives later, offering a simplified account. Imagine standing inside the control room of an enormous ship. Thousands of engineers below deck keep engines running, maintain navigation systems, regulate temperature, calculate fuel consumption, and monitor structural integrity. Meanwhile, a tour guide speaks through the loudspeaker, calmly describing the journey. If the guide disappeared, the ship would continue moving. If the engineers disappeared, the guide would have nothing left to describe. The narrator resembles the guide far more than the engineers. It specializes in explanation, not operation. This distinction becomes especially visible under extreme conditions. Athletes call it being in the zone. Musicians experience it during flawless performances. Surgeons report entering extraordinary states of concentration where action unfolds effortlessly. Time seems to distort. Self-consciousness fades. The internal commentary grows quiet. Performance often improves. Psychologist Csikszentmihalyi devoted decades to studying these experiences, eventually describing them as states of flow. Flow occurs when attention becomes completely absorbed in the present activity. The narrator does not disappear entirely, but it stops interrupting. Instead of commenting on each movement, awareness merges with action itself. The pianist is no longer thinking about playing. The pianist is simply playing. The climber is no longer analyzing each movement. The climber becomes the movement. Many people describe these moments as among the happiest of their lives. Curiously, happiness often appears not when the narrator gains more control, but when it temporarily relinquishes it. This observation echoes findings from contemplative traditions developed thousands of years earlier. Zen practitioners speak of no mind, not as the absence of intelligence, but as freedom from compulsive internal commentary. Taoist philosophy describes effortless action, Wu Wei, where behavior arises naturally rather than through constant mental interference. These teachings are frequently misunderstood as encouraging passivity. In reality, they point toward a different relationship with thought. The voice remains useful. It simply ceases to dominate every moment of experience. Consider how children interact with the world before self-conscious narration becomes fully established. A young child watching rain does not immediately analyze whether the moment is meaningful enough for social media. A child building a sandcastle is rarely comparing the result with someone else's achievement. Attention rests almost entirely within direct experience. Development gradually introduces a more elaborate narrator. This transformation brings extraordinary advantages: planning, language, complex reasoning, long-term cooperation. Civilizations could not exist without these capacities. Yet every gift carries a cost. The same narrator capable of imagining tomorrow can also become trapped inside tomorrow. The same memory that preserves wisdom can endlessly replay pain. The same imagination that creates art can manufacture fear. The instrument itself is not the problem. Identification is. Imagine borrowing a sophisticated navigation system for a long journey. Initially, it helps you avoid danger and find efficient routes. But after years of relying upon it, you forget that it is merely a tool. Eventually, every direction it suggests feels like absolute truth, even when the road before your own eyes clearly says otherwise. The narrator functions much the same way. It predicts, advises, warns, remembers, plans. These functions are invaluable. Problems arise only when every prediction becomes unquestionable reality. One of the most fascinating discoveries in psychology concerns something known as cognitive diffusion. Rather than attempting to eliminate difficult thoughts, people learn to recognize thoughts as mental events rather than literal facts. A thought saying, "I'm going to fail," becomes exactly that, a thought, not prophecy, not certainty, not identity. Clinical research has shown that this subtle shift can significantly reduce the emotional grip of anxiety, depression, and chronic stress. Nothing external changes. The relationship to the narrator changes. It is almost as though the voice continues broadcasting on the same frequency, but awareness no longer mistakes every broadcast for objective reality. The narrator loses none of its intelligence. It simply loses its monopoly. This distinction may explain why some individuals remain remarkably calm under circumstances that overwhelm others. It is not necessarily because they experience fewer fearful thoughts. It is because they believe fewer of them. Thoughts continue arising, but they pass through awareness without immediately becoming identity. The sky does not resist the clouds. It allows them to move on. Perhaps consciousness functions in a similar way, not by controlling every thought, but by providing the space within which every thought appears. If so, then the voice inside your head resembles weather far more than architecture, sometimes bright, sometimes stormy, always changing, never permanent. Yet one profound question remains unresolved. If awareness is the space in which thoughts arise, if the narrator is only one process unfolding within that space, and if your deepest identity may not be the voice at all, then why has nearly every human being throughout history mistaken the storyteller for the self? The answer may lie in a final illusion, one so subtle that it quietly shapes every experience from the moment we are born. It is the illusion that there is someone inside the mind who has been speaking from the very beginning, and that illusion may be the most convincing story the narrator has ever told. If the greatest story the narrator has ever told is that it has always been you, then the final question is unavoidable. Who are you without the story? It is an unsettling question because the mind immediately rushes to answer it. I am my memories. I am my personality. I am my beliefs. I am my profession. I am my relationships. Listen carefully to each answer. Every one of them is another thought, another description, another sentence spoken by the same familiar voice. The narrator cannot answer the question without becoming part of the question itself. This is where the investigation reaches its deepest point, not because science has failed, not because philosophy has reached a dead end, but because every attempt to define awareness turns awareness into an object, while awareness is the very condition that makes every object knowable. Imagine trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. Your eyes make vision possible, but they cannot directly observe themselves. Consciousness may possess the same paradoxical quality. It illuminates every experience, yet it cannot stand outside itself to become another experience. This explains why humanity has approached the mystery from so many directions. Neuroscientists examine electrical activity. Psychologists analyze cognition. Philosophers explore logic. Mystics investigate direct experience. Each discipline reveals part of the landscape. None appears to possess the entire map. Neuroscience continues identifying brain networks associated with attention, memory, emotion, and self-reference. Psychology reveals how identity is constructed through development, attachment, and narrative. Philosophy exposes the assumptions hidden inside language itself. Contemplative traditions demonstrate that subjective experience can be explored with extraordinary precision through disciplined observation. Rather than contradicting one another, these perspectives increasingly resemble different lenses examining the same mystery. The voice exists. The brain generates it. Experience shapes it. Culture influences it. Memory edits it. Emotion colors it. Language structures it. Evolution refined it. Yet none of these explanations fully accounts for the simple fact that experience is happening at all. This is what philosopher David Chalmers famously called the hard problem of consciousness. Science can explain how neurons communicate. It can identify which brain regions activate during perception. It can predict behavior with increasing accuracy. But explaining why physical processes should produce subjective experience remains one of the greatest unsolved questions in modern knowledge. Perhaps future discoveries will eventually answer it. Perhaps they will not. Either way, one practical truth already stands before us. Whether consciousness emerges entirely from the brain, or whether awareness possesses qualities we do not yet understand, the narrator remains only one process within the larger phenomenon of experience. And that realization changes something profoundly practical. Consider how much suffering originates not from events themselves, but from the endless commentary surrounding them. Embarrassment becomes years of self-condemnation. Failure becomes permanent identity. Loss becomes proof that joy is impossible. The event ends. The narrator continues, sometimes for decades. Two people may endure remarkably similar hardships. One gradually heals. The other remains trapped inside the same internal story for the rest of life. Often the difference lies less in what happened than in the relationship each person develops with the voice explaining what happened. The narrator excels at preserving continuity. Healing often begins by interrupting continuity, not by denying the past. Not by pretending pain never existed, but by recognizing that no single story can ever exhaust the truth of a human life. Every autobiography is incomplete. Every identity remains unfinished. Every conclusion is provisional. This understanding does not weaken responsibility. It strengthens it. If the narrator is continuously shaping experience, then paying attention to what it repeatedly rehearses becomes one of the most important acts of human freedom. Not because every thought can be controlled. They cannot. But because attention itself influences which thoughts receive nourishment. A fearful thought noticed without attachment often fades. A fearful thought rehearsed for months becomes a worldview. Compassion follows the same principle. So does gratitude. So does curiosity. Neuroplasticity reminds us that repeated patterns gradually reshape the brain that produces them. The narrator learns from what awareness repeatedly chooses to practice. In that sense, authorship may exist, not in creating every thought, but in choosing which stories become foundations for tomorrow. This may explain why wisdom across cultures so often emphasizes attention. Attention determines experience. Experience shapes memory. Memory shapes identity. Identity influences future attention. The cycle continually reinforces itself. Break the cycle at attention, and the entire pattern begins to change. Perhaps this is why moments of genuine presence feel so transformative. Walking through falling snow, listening to ocean waves, watching a sleeping child breathe, standing beneath a sky filled with stars. For a brief instant, the narrator stops measuring, stops comparing, stops predicting. Reality no longer needs constant explanation. It simply unfolds. These moments rarely feel empty. They feel astonishingly full, not because something new has entered consciousness, because unnecessary noise has temporarily receded. Many people spend years searching for extraordinary experiences while overlooking this simple possibility. Perhaps peace is not something the narrator achieves. Perhaps peace is what remains when the narrator no longer insists on speaking over every moment. This does not mean abandoning thought. Civilization depends upon thinking. Medicine, science, engineering, art, justice, language. The narrator is one of humanity's greatest evolutionary achievements. The invitation is not to silence it forever. The invitation is to place it back into its proper role. A trusted advisor, not an unquestioned ruler. A storyteller, not the author. A remarkable biological instrument, not the entirety of who you are. Imagine reading a beautiful novel while never forgetting that you are the reader. You can become emotionally invested. You can cry. You can celebrate. You can learn. But somewhere quietly, you remain aware that the pages are not the totality of your existence. Perhaps consciousness works in the same way. The story matters. The storyteller matters. But neither completely defines the awareness within which the story unfolds. So the next time the familiar voice begins its endless commentary, when it predicts failure before you have tried, when it replays an old humiliation, when it insists you are trapped by yesterday, pause for a single moment. Do not argue with it. Do not suppress it. Simply notice it. Notice the sentence. Notice the emotion. Notice the impulse to believe it immediately. Then ask one question. Who heard that? Not to force an answer, not to discover a new belief, but to experience, even for a heartbeat, the quiet presence that existed before the thought appeared and remains after the thought has passed. That silent presence has accompanied you through every joy, every fear, every success, every disappointment, every identity you have ever worn. It was there when you were a child. It remained while your body changed. It remained while your opinions changed. It remained while relationships began and ended. It remained while the narrator rewrote your autobiography thousands of times. The voice inside your head has changed with every chapter of your life. The listener never had to. And perhaps that is the final revelation. The voice inside your head is real. It is brilliant. It is indispensable. It protects you, warns you, imagines your future, and weaves the story of your past. But it is not the whole of you. It never was. The narrator tells the story. Awareness allows the story to exist. And somewhere between those two lies one of the oldest and most enduring mysteries humanity has ever dared to explore. The next thought is already on its way. The question is no longer whether you will hear it. The question is whether, for the first time, you will recognize the quiet listener who always hears first.